The Great Hunger of the 1840s is undeniably one of the most important events in Irish history. However, it's not just a story of hunger and loss. The famine swept away entire communities, it erased traditions and left silence in its wake. It can be almost impossible to even imagine what life was like for so many of our ancestors before the Great Hunger. So many people's stories were never recorded. Their names, their struggles and their daily lives have faded into silence. But sometimes a single story can cut through that silence and offer us a glimpse into this lost world. Mary Doherty is one such case. In 1844, she was working as a servant in a house in Donegal. Her life was ordinary and she would almost certainly have been, like most people in her generation, forgotten until tragedy struck and her life was cut short by a neighbour. For a brief moment, Mary would become the subject of a major investigation, leading to official documents and newspaper reports that capture not only Mary's tragic story, but also the world she lived in. In this video, the historian Angela Byrne joins me, Fin Dwyer, to explore the story and tragedy of Mary Doherty, but also the world she lived in. Angela is going to set the scene of Mary's story by sharing what life was like in Ireland before the famine of the 1840s. And this is challenging in so many ways. We're going to focus in on the community of Kuldaff in North Donegal that provides incredible insights into general Irish life at the time, how people lived, where they lived, how illegal distillation of alcohol was a major feature of life in that part of Ireland, and also how this drew in a huge police presence into the area. It's a fascinating snapshot of life in Ireland before the Great Hunger. All the while, we'll be building up a picture of this teenager, Mary Doherty, and what happened to her in 1844. It's an incredible story that's been forgotten for over 200 years, but also gives us a snapshot into what is often a forgotten world. Now, after this video, if you do want to find out more about this story, I have a feature-length podcast interview with Angela linked below, and I also have a link to her book, Finding Mary, where she has published this story in great detail. It's a fascinating read, and as I say, I have that linked below. Now, to start out on our journey to the 1840s, I asked Angela to set the scene by describing Kuldaff, the community where a lot of what we're going to talk about played out. And this gives us an incredible insight into Ireland at the time. So Angela starts by painting a picture of Kuldaff in North Donegal on the eve of the Great Hunger, when Mary Doherty would meet her tragic end.
So in 1844, when Mary died, the village had about 130 people living in it, but the parish had almost 6,000. So we're talking an overwhelmingly rural place. Most people are small farmers. You know, there are rabbit warrens near the beach, near the village. There's obviously some fishing. People are harvesting turf. They're living in little two-room cabins. And they had quite a basic standard of living. There wasn't a massive variety in the daily diet. Charles McGlinchey even described, and it was surprising to me because we think of ourselves as a nation of tea drinkers, but even when he was a child in the 1860s, he said tea was hardly ever taken. You know, people didn't have the money for it, and that kind of commodity economy hadn't quite reached them yet. So they were living a life that I think is quite hard for us to imagine, and it was quite an insular place, but at the same time they were near the port of Derry when you think of the Foyle flowing round the peninsula and down into the city. But it was, you know, a day's walk to get to Derry.
Now, because Angela's research focused on Mary Doherty's case, she explored the world of policing in Donegal, and this revealed a fascinating aspect of life that otherwise might be overlooked. Like, I had no idea Donegal on the eve of the Great Hunger was the centre of illegal distillation of poitín, not only in Ireland but in the broader region. And Angela explains how this drew in large amounts of police and customs officials into this very remote community. She picks up the story here.
Just to expand out on that wee bit, for some background, there was loads of imperial infrastructure around Inishowen. So there was Martello Towers dotted around. That's linked to, you know, the kind of the threat from France 40 years earlier. And then in the 1830s, you see the revenue police moving into the area. They end up coming there because of Inishowen's connection to Scotland, which is one of the things that contributes to Inishowen becoming one of the major centres for illegal distillation in the whole of Britain and Ireland. So when the revenue police is set up, they send a third of their force initially to County Donegal. It's totally overrepresented nationally in terms of the assignment of officers and stations to the area. And Inishowen itself is kind of known as being a centre of illegal distillation. So I had one source from the era that said something like the people were involved in this trade from their cradles. It was in them. And when you think of the landscape, they could be on these remote hillsides distilling away, and it could be very hard to find them. So I had another source from the late 1820s of a lady traveller who's unnamed, but she describes the horses, kind of tramping out of the big barracks in Derry to go into Inishowen, the military force to go into Inishowen and deal with the illegal distillers. And she feels an awful lot of sympathy for the distillers because she says on these hillsides they need something to keep them warm. This partly explains the presence of the police. So in Kuldaff, when Mary is murdered, you have ordinary police, the Irish Constabulary, and you have revenue police. And their lives were quite comfortable, I guess, compared to most of the people that they lived amongst. So they were in receipt of a regular salary, they were assigned clothing and uniforms and bedding. They were all living together in the barracks in the main street of the village. But it wasn't a job that just anyone could go for. So you had to have a certain amount of money yourself to even join the force. And you had to go through your training down in Dublin. So there was a big training centre for the revenue police in Drumcondra, for instance. So you'd have to go and do that.
Can you give us a sense of Mary Doherty's place in this world? I think throughout the book, you convey really well that we know very little about her, but there are snapshots of her life. She was very young, almost a child by today's standards, but like aspects of her life certainly portray that she was treated, maybe not viewed, but treated as maybe an older person. She had a job. Can you talk a bit about Mary's life in this context?
What I had set out to do actually when I started writing this book was to piece together Mary's life. And it turned out to be quite challenging. Her name was only written down 4 times in the sources. We often find that still with victims of violent crime. It's the perpetrator rather than a victim who's best remembered, and that was certainly the case here. But Mary was 14-year-old servant, as they put it at the time, in a farmhouse. It was one of the slightly better farmhouses in the parish, but still quite basic standard of living. Her day-to-day duties would have been pretty exhausting. If you think about the era before electricity, before any of the kind of machines that help us day to day, everything was done by hand. So she would have been the first up in the morning. She would have lit the fire, put on a pot of porridge or potatoes or something for the family to eat. And her day from there would have gone probably ranging from care for any children in the house or elderly relatives living in the house, because these households were often multi-generational. I often liked to think of her kind of scattering the feed for the chickens out the front, because then she would have been able to see across to the foil and maybe catch the glimpse of a ship passing by or something like that.
And then if we move to the murder itself, which I suppose is the only reason why Mary is known to us today, I think, I suppose a lot of what we've talked about so far will be the experience of thousands of people who are not remembered in historical records at all. But maybe, can you just explain, first of all, how common murder was at the time, or violence in jet? Like, was this a violent society? Just to get again that context of the world she lived in.
Ireland at the time was considered a violent place. The statistics bear this out. Other historians have published studies on violent crime in Irish society. The statistics at the time did show that Ireland had proportionately a much higher rate of violent crime and homicide than England or Wales. In 1844, there was 106 homicides reported in Ireland. Donegal was one of the counties with one of the lower rates of homicide, even though there was that kind of low-level criminality in the area with all the potsheen distilling and everything that was going on. But homicide was so shocking. And I think one of the things that made Mary's murder even more shocking, so to us, the first consideration is her age. She's 14-year-old girl. That to us is a child. She's never spoken of as a child in the sources, and I think that's because she was in paid employment already. Her childhood was over. But to me, one of the things that made it even more shocking, and especially this kind of, it's never said, but it comes across in some of the newspaper reports to me as an undertone, the fact that it took place in the home. It wasn't her home, but it was someone's home and she was working there. The fact that it happened in the domestic space, because in the mid-Victoria era, especially, for kind of like the middle and upper classes, the domestic space is the realm of women.
If we move on to the crime itself, it takes place, as you say, on a Sunday, and there is somewhat conflicting views, I suppose, or versions of the event come out in the weeks and months and years afterwards. But can you give listeners a sense of what we know definitely happened, and maybe we'll kind of pick through some of the aftermath as well and other rumours, I suppose, that came out?
So, as best I could, the picture that emerged of the events that morning was that James McKeaney and his family had gone to Mass, leaving their servant Mary Doherty to keep the house. While they were gone, James's nephew, Daniel McKeaney, came to the house with the aim of stealing the savings that he knew his uncle and cousin had kept in a chest in the house. I don't know whether he walked in to find Mary in the kitchen or whether he was in the middle of the burglary and she walked back in, maybe from doing some chore outside, but their paths crossed unexpectedly in the kitchen.
At this point, I'm just going to jump in here because the details of what happened to Mary would definitely get this video flagged on YouTube. But Angela picks up the story now in the aftermath of the attack on Mary.
Then he went outside. He scrubbed a bloodstain from his sleeve and from his hands, and he hid the 50 shillings that he stole somewhere around his father's house, which was nearby. Then he proceeded to a friend's house to secure an alibi for himself. Then Mass is over, the McKeaneys come back, they find this dreadful scene in their kitchen, and they call the authority, and the first authority they call is the landlord. The police are called, a revenue police officer and an Irish constabulary officer come. A doctor is called to do an inquest, and another local landlord, who's also a justice of the peace, is brought to the scene. They kind of confer and very quickly decide there's one clear culprit here, and it's Daniel McKeaney. He has a bad reputation in the area. So they start to search for him around the town, and they find him in a house in the village before too long, and he's immediately arrested and brought to the police station in Kuldaff.
Does he have to go to Derry to prison, or where is he held?
So he's brought to Lifford, which is the county town. It's the site of the county jail. He's brought there. It's quite a long journey down to Lifford. Donegal's a big county. He's brought there to await the next assizes or the next court. So there's spring assizes and summer assizes. They're March and July. I'll just say first about Lifford jail. It didn't have very good reports at the time. The cells were described as like dungeon-like. And we're really lucky in Donegal local history that the turnkeys reports survive. They're so interesting. They could be punished for speaking Irish. They could be punished for, say if someone was already being punished by having their ration withheld and you shared your ration with them, you would be punished for sharing your ration. So it's just the variety of infractions that the inmates could have held against them, the varieties of the punishments. So Daniel does end up spending quite a lot of time in Lifford jail, because when the next assizes come up in July, the prosecution decided they only have circumstantial evidence against him. And they say, we want to defer trial to the next assizes so we can have more time to gather more evidence. So that means waiting until March of the following year. So it was actually pretty much 53 weeks after Mary's murder that Daniel is brought to trial, really kind of for the second time, but really for the first time.
Over this period as well, there's something of a jailhouse confession that adds more detail to his supposed or potential motive. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I suppose it's a controversial aspect of the case.
He's sharing a cell with a man named Michael Gallagher, who's from the south of the county. And he has just been sentenced to 10 years transportation for stealing 2 cows. Michael is married with 2 young kids. The younger one is only 3 months old. So he and his wife put their heads together. She comes to visit him in the jail. In the middle of that visit, he gets up from the table and he goes to make a report to the superintendent of the jail to say, my cellmate McKeaney is after confessing to me that he did kill that girl and that he hid the money in the thatch of his father's house. And he has other details as well pertaining to the crime. So the prison authorities have to treat this seriously, even though they're kind of skeptical. And from the very outset, they're saying, look, this guy's facing 10 years. He's obviously just trying to get his sentence reduced or commuted. While he's appealing to the prison authorities, his wife makes an appeal to the Lord Lieutenant. And these sources are so interesting. This is the voice of the wife of a tenant farmer from South Donegal who's facing into being left on her own with an infirm mother-in-law and two very young kids. And she's appealing that she will be left destitute unless her husband's sentence is reduced or commuted.
Now, ultimately, the shaky testimony of that prisoner would not be enough to convict McKeany, and indeed he never actually stood trial for what happened to Mary. Now, he didn't get off scot-free. He was actually convicted of sheep stealing and eventually transported to Australia. But Angela has done an incredible job, not only of recreating Mary's life that was largely forgotten for centuries, but also the world she lived in. You can find out more about this in our feature-length podcast. I've linked that below. You can also find Angela's book, Finding Mary, there as well. It's really worth a read. If you're not subscribed to the channel, please subscribe now and ring the bell. That means you'll get the next video when it comes out next week. And if you're looking for something to watch right now, I'd recommend checking out this video up here. It explores a medieval Irish castle that's been restored. So we talk all about what it was like to live in a castle in the Middle Ages. It's really well worth checking out. I'll be back next week. Until then, slán.